Hi, everyone, and welcome to our talk today, For the Love of Iris. This presentation is a collaboration between Gamble Garden, the Women's Club of Palo Alto, and MOA, Museum of American Heritage. We are delighted to welcome all of you here today, and many of you are members of and supporters of these three amazing organizations. A little housekeeping today. First, to ensure audio quality for everyone's benefit in today's presentation, please remember to keep yourself on mute unless you are presenting. And second, we encourage you to enter any questions that may occur to you during the talk into the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And Sue Crumbine will be moderating a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. The iris was beloved by two remarkable women in Palo Alto history, Dora Williams and Elizabeth Gamble. In fact, all of us at Gamble Garden are fond of saying that the iris was Elizabeth's favorite flower. In today's talk, we are going to learn how the passion for these stately, fragrant flowers became a signature in gardens nearly a century ago, and how we continue to enjoy them today. And now, I would like to introduce you to Allison Wong, the Executive Director of MOA, who will introduce our speaker. Allison.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. So welcome, everybody. We're happy to co-host our first program with Gamble Garden and the Women's Club of Palo Alto. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Before I introduce Betsy, I just wanted to let you know our museum is doing an iris raffle, and Betsy will touch upon this at the end of the lecture. So now I would like to introduce to you Betsy Freiberger. She has been involved in MOA and Gamble Garden for many years as a volunteer. At MOA, Betsy leads a small crew of garden volunteers and our gardener to help beautify and maintain our gardens. She has contributed to several projects within the MOA gardens. One among them is an iris transplantation project. We are lucky to have her as a volunteer and experienced gardener to lend her hand in our gardens. In her professional life, Betsy is a curator emeritus of prints and drawings at the Stanford Museum, now the Cantor, where she enjoyed a 40-year career. Please, everyone, welcome Betsy.
Well, thank you very much. And can you all hear me now? Yes, good. So this is a perfect time of year for a talk about iris, particularly bearded iris, because so many of them are in bloom. And in Palo Alto, there are many, many bearded irises in many gardens, and it's the perfect climate for bearded iris. They are tough, but they basically love sunshine. And what they do not like is water. That's the fastest and only way I really know to kill them. But anyway, today I want to encourage you all to go out into your own gardens and see where maybe you can use an iris in your garden where you don't have one. And I'm going to talk about several different kinds of iris, which have several different kinds of environment that they thrive in. Some like the sun, some like more water, and so on. So I'll go a little bit into that. But mostly I want to encourage you all to visit Gamble and the Williams Garden, which is at Homer in MOA. MOA occupies the house and the garden surrounds the house. Now, I've spent something like 45 years as an art museum curator, so I figure I probably have my 10,000 hours. So I think I have deep learning of art, working with art objects, not just reading about them. And I really feel the same about my garden experience, that yes, I've been on committees and gone to meetings, but I've spent lots of hours getting my fingernails dirty and actually ruining my back at some points. But anyway, it's been a wonderful experience, and I hope to encourage people who aren't so already involved in gardens, maybe to volunteer at a garden, or at least go visit a garden or a nursery. And anyway, just get out there and get your own firsthand experience. So every garden has a story to tell, and probably more than one story. And many mature gardens have layers of stories to tell. And so I've been interested for a long time in garden history. And so one of the first questions one asks about both the Gamble Garden and the Williams Garden is, what brought the Gambles and the Williams to this area? The obvious answer is Stanford University. And Stanford brought almost everybody who came out here at the end of the 19th century. So young Leland died in 1881, and the grieving parents decided to dedicate and start a university in memory of their only child. And the university opened in 1891. And actually, Thomas Merton Williams arrived in 1893. He was in one of the very earliest classes. He graduated in 1897, as did his wife, Dora. And less than a decade later, Edwin Percy Gamble and his family arrived with their 4 children who they wanted to go to attend the university. And their 3 sons graduated from Stanford, but Elizabeth transferred to Vassar. She didn't find the German department at Stanford suitably distinguished, challenging, whatever. But it was Elizabeth, of course, who returned to Palo Alto, and it's really Elizabeth, the gardener, that we'll be talking about. Now, the Williams family had 2 daughters, both of whom graduated from Stanford in the late 1920s, but actually the daughters weren't so interested in the garden. It was their mother, Dora, who was the great gardener. So both the Williams and Gamble properties were family oriented, and they were homes first and foremost. So there were carriages. Gamble has a carriage house, which accommodated first carriages and then automobiles. And today it's a setting for classes and special activities. Tom Gamble, who became a doctor, was one of the first automobile owners in Palo Alto. And on the Homer property, you can see he has a separate garage, and you can see a wonderful old automobile. Now, since Gamble was located outside the city limit, which at that point was Embarcadero, it had its own water tower. And one of my real regrets is there's no sort of mention or reference to the water tower, which of course was essential to any garden in those early years. And both properties produced food for the family, excuse me, vegetables, probably they had fruit trees. And some of the people who were interviewed about the Williams Garden talked very fondly of Sunday afternoon meals there with fruit, ice cream made from fruit from their fruit trees. But any design or attention to a formal design was really not part of the early plantings of either of these gardens. So the Gamble children were about a generation older than the 2 Williams daughters, who were born very shortly after 1900. And unfortunately, we have very few family records or photographs of either garden. And we know that they existed, but we just don't have them. But I'm going to show you, wait a minute, don't do it now. I'm going to show you some 1930s photographs of the Williams Garden, excuse me. So both gardens were suffered a period of neglect between the time that they were left to the city and when they were actually arrangements had been made to use them in some kind of a way. And I want to just describe roughly. Gamble is about 2.6 acres. And the Williams Garden and property originally occupied half of the city block between Homer and Forest along Waverly. But they sold off much of that property by the late 1920s. And today the property is, my guess is, it's just a guess, a third of its original size. Now, the character and intention of these 2 properties stands in strong contrast to a garden such as Filoli, which was conceived of in a grand manner and suitable for a stately country house. And its construction, of course, was supported by the fortune from the Empire Mine and the city of San Francisco's water company. Conveniently, Filoli's wooded acres looked down to the Crystal Springs lakes, which became the Hetch Hetchy Reservoir. And Mr. and Mrs. Bourne hired a landscape architect to design their garden. The Gamble Garden and the Williams Garden didn't have any garden designers. They did everything themselves. So Filoli has a 16-acre formal garden set in a very impressive coastal range. Now I'm going to show you the first slide, Doug. Thanks. And it's of a rainbow. And the reason is rainbow in Greek is Iris. And Iris was the messenger between gods and humans. And this is a watercolor done in the summer of 1817 by the famous British painter, James Mallard William Turner, taken on a sketching trip down the Rhine River. And it's a wonderfully impressionistic watercolor. And I think it reminds me of how gardens change when the light is different, under rain, under different conditions.
This is empty.
The wonderfully impressionistic watercolor actually is in the Stanford Museum. So I've had a close relationship with it for many, many years. So I want to make just a few more general remarks about irises before we look more closely at the plants in the two Palo Alto gardens. Now, the iris family is a very large genus, close to maybe 300 species, and they're native to most parts of the world, especially northern temperate climates. So if you want to look up an extensive iris collection, I'll mention just three: the Presby Memorial Iris Gardens in New Jersey, the Giardino del Iris in Florence, which is only open for the month-long period of bloom, and the Iris Bliss collection in England. I have unfortunately not been to any of those. I've just read about them. Wikipedia's article about iris includes something like 60 references and a number of links. And actually, among its illustrations are two that are very closely related to what I'm going to be talking about. So the iris has been chosen as a symbol of various countries and states and cities. And one historical anecdote about the yellow iris, which is called the flag iris. The Roman army was trying to cross the Rhine River, and they were trying to find a shallow part of the river. And somebody noticed that there were these yellow flag irises growing along the banks. And so they crossed the river successfully. That just shows you how much water some iris like, but not the kind of iris that we're talking about today. But iris became popular as symbols of countries, cities, states. They were adorned many coats of arms. And so you could say historically, the iris have been widely recognized. And they grow in various parts of the world, but mainly in the Northern Hemisphere. And just in terms of bearded iris, there's something like 30,000 hybrids, cultivars. So you can see it's been enormously popular. And I'm going to talk now about the Gamble and the Williams Garden. So can I have the next slide, please? And so this is a photograph of Elizabeth Gamble. Now, the Gambles came from the very large Procter and Gamble families of Irish heritage. And the money came from such necessities as candles and soap, as in ivory soap, and go back to the time of the Civil War. And the countryside around Cincinnati was a bustling, prosperous city and along the Ohio River. And the family evidently had farming land, at least this branch of the family did. So they would have been familiar with the kind of landscape one found on the peninsula when they moved out here. Open fields, majestic old oak trees. And what brought them to Stanford was, of course, they wanted an education for their children, and they knew they had connections, academic connections with David Starr Jordan, and an interest in the natural sciences. One son later became a rancher, another a doctor, and there is a Gamble winery. We know Elizabeth was interested in the iris as well as camellias. Among the few receipts that Gamble has are visits to Japanese nurseries where she bought some camellias. And there are some very interesting historic camellias at Gamble, and they're quite well labeled. And Gamble has been included on several tours of older camellias, some of which have been moved at Gamble. They're not in their original location because, of course, they grew too large for their original siting. Now, the plan of Gamble has today had nothing to do really with what was on the existing 2.6 acres. The plan was outlined and researched by Lucy Tolmack, the wonderful superintendent at Filoli, who was instrumental in also helping the transition with the Williams Garden. And the Gamble Garden design is based on research of what gardens pre-World War I looked like, with their garden rooms, hedges, fences defining different areas. And the current fence, painted dark green at Gamble, is in fact based on a remaining fragment of the original fence. The gazebo, however, was constructed in the late 80s, at 1980s. So I was a docent at Gamble for a number of years, but I could say much more about the Gamble family, but this isn't really the place to do that. I would urge you to sign up for a docent tour or come to some of the second Saturdays. And more recently, I've been learning about the Williams family, and may have the next slide. And much of the information about the Williams family is at Stanford in special collections. And this photograph is among those family photographs. Thomas Merton Williams was born in a very small town called Duo, D-U-O. I wonder if that meant that there were very few people there. Anyway, in the hills of West Virginia, and that's a region that I have visited. It's picturesque and rather remote, little valley with farms. My husband's grandmother was born there, probably less than 50 miles away from where Tom Williams was born. Now, he wrote a reminiscence, a copy of which is at Stanford in special collections, as are these photographs, as are other documents about him. And he had a complicated family. There were several children from different marriages and so on. And he was delivered at birth by his older sister, who was age 13. So you can see that that was a rather remote life in West Virginia. And then he describes a bear hunt in great detail. But then he goes to a military prep school that was associated with the University of West Virginia. And he evidently heard about Stanford there from a friend. And so he decided to go to Stanford. His friend dropped out and didn't, but he traveled to Stanford. And when he got to Palo Alto, there was some problem. He didn't have money. He was setting up an account and he needed money. So he went to the bank, and it turned out that the bank president was also from West Virginia, which was very helpful. And then he walked from the train station to the campus and was given a ride by someone. And he tried to give this someone a tip, but it turns out that the person who kindly gave him a ride was actually David Starr Jordan, the president of Stanford. So at Stanford, Tom Williams played football. Later he was active in the Alumni Association, and at one point even head of it. And he was a member later in life as a successful doctor of the Bohemian Club. He was one of the founders of the San Francisco Opera. So he was a very engaged person. And he was a friend of Herbert Hoover. He and Dora stayed at the White House for a couple of days at some point. Now, his wife, Dora, came from quite a wealthy family. And she was born in Brattleboro, Vermont. And actually, I've spent quite a lot of time in Brattleboro, Vermont, because our son and his family live close by. And it's another one of these prosperous 19th century small cities, which today is not so prosperous. I think you all know that kind of story. Anyway, the Este family made organs, and the Este Organ Company was the largest manufacturer in the world of the American reed organ known as the pump organ. Well, actually, there's a museum in Brattleboro, which of course I've been to long before I knew any of this connection and seen these organs. But these were small organs that middle-class families could have in their living rooms. And, you know, it was a status symbol and so on. Well, Dora had a rather unhappy childhood. Her mother died very early. She was raised by her grandmother, who had moved to Pasadena. And she ended up at Stanford as a transfer student. First, she'd gone to the University of the Pacific, and she and Tom met at a geology picnic, but they both graduated from 1897 from Stanford, but then they moved to New York, and he got his medical degree at Columbia. But then he decided he liked the Bay Area. He came west, and they lived in San Francisco briefly. And then he bought property along Skyline Boulevard, South Skyline, and they built a cabin and then had their two daughters. And then they bought property in Palo Alto, and they engaged the British-born architect, Ernest Coxhead, to design a separate house and office. And they were connected by a breezeway. And probably most of you know what Ernest Coxhead's houses in San Francisco look like. This really didn't look like them. A lot of his houses in San Francisco are in a different style, but this is a very matter-of-fact building. And the only thing that made me think immediately that an architect had a hand in it has a rather gracious, wide staircase. Unlike the staircase in the Gamble entrance hall to the house is very sort of cramped and narrow, and the staircase just goes up the stairs, whereas in the Williams house, there's a much nicer flow of space. Next slide. And so here's the exterior of the house. And you see the dark area at the right, and that actually is the breezeway, and to the right, but hidden behind the tree, is the doctor's office. So there's a driveway on the left-hand side, and you see a little fence, and you see very small shrubs. Well, they planted along the driveway and along Homer this hedge, which lived for almost 100 years. We've had to replace some of it in the last few years, but it's amazing. It's been amazingly long-lived. And we have a bit of early fencing that we have preserved that's along the driveway. So you can see what the early boundaries sort of looked like. And these were in the middle of open fields. So there were all sorts of animals around. And so you wanted some privacy. So you built a hedge and had a fence. And so then, next slide. So this is slightly later. There their two daughters are, and there's a car in the rear. And the Virginia creeper is beginning to creep, as you can see. And eventually it must have covered all the walls, because one of the things that happened when the city took over is I think they had to, the whole building had to be replastered because the Virginia creeper was so entrenched. But you can see there's no fancy garden. It's a rather ordinary house. Next, please. And so here is the chairs and so on. That is the breezeway. And then by 1930, they had built a wall separating. So when you came in the footpath, you went directly to the doctor's office. But if you came in along the driveway, there was an entrance to the house. And then you can see the furniture raised out there. And then from their travels in the 30s, there is a very large vase, really large vase that they brought back. Unfortunately, that's not there today. Next slide. And this is just another photograph that shows you the wall, and it shows you the door and the wall and some outdoor furniture. But you can see there are quite a few trees. You can see the Virginia creeper ever creeping. Next slide. And then here is the flower garden. The garden was divided into 3 parts. And the first part on the left-hand side in the front was sort of where the family sat out. There was a small lawn that was used for outdoor purposes. And then on the other side is the flower garden. And then in the back of this photograph is an arbor. And behind the arbor is a vegetable garden and some fruit trees. And there was a clothesline, and there's a garage. And so today you can see the garage is still there. No clothesline. Next slide. And here is the only photograph I have of Dora Williams in her garden. And she's walking around the paths, which she must have designed. Somebody in the family designed these paths. And in the next slide, can I have the next slide? Oh goodness, well, all right, this one, this is the driveway, and they had a little pond. Well, today the pond has been filled in. You can see the stones along the edge. But today there is a giant redwood there. Now, interestingly enough, I know from other photographs that redwood wasn't planted till 1950. Now, the redwoods next to the path that you enter the garden in were planted almost, 50 years earlier. And so when you go there, just look at them and see if you can tell the difference. I think the redwood that was next to the pond got a lot more water, grew a lot faster, but the pond no longer exists. Next. Now here you begin to see the bearded iris, and you can see the stones that outlined the paths. And so that they're very charming curved paths lined with stones that came from the family's property up along Skyline Drive. And just think of the labor bringing down all those stones. These are heavy stones, and there are many of them. But you can see there's a whole bed of bearded iris. But these are photographs that don't show a great detail, and they're all in black and white. So they're helpful, but they're frustrating to use. Next. So this gives you an idea of the curving paths. And this photograph was taken shortly after the garden was cleaned up. After the youngest daughter, Rona, died in I don't have the date here, but she left the property to the city, and it took about 10 years for the city to reach a conclusion of what to do with it. And there's something of the same story for Gamble Garden. At one point, for Gamble, they thought they were going to tear down the house and destroy the garden and build low-income housing. But the Garden Club of Palo Alto was instrumental in helping save that garden. And we are all very thankful that they did that. And we have the garden to enjoy today. But the stones in the Williams garden, somebody came up with a myth that they came from the rubble of the earthquake at Stanford. But then somebody else finally had the rocks analyzed, and the quarry that is in East San Jose that the Stanford buildings come from, you can tell that it's a different kind of rock from the rocks that line these paths. And the rocks that line these paths are from the kind of rock that is found in the coastal range. Okay, next slide. Well, this is another view of the garden and the paths. And so, by the time these photographs were taken, the garden had really been sort of deserted, abandoned for almost 10 years. And so a lot of the plantings that you saw in an earlier photograph, had died. The trees survived, and bearded iris, this shows you exactly how tough bearded iris are. They are survivors. And so we're thankful for that. And one of the first things I did when I started volunteering at MOA is the bearded iris needed to be divided badly. And they'd been divided off and on, but they were in a real jumble. Well, they're still in a jumble. It's not quite as bad as it was. But just last year, for the second time, we dug them up and divided them and tried to bring some order to them. So I'm going to tell you something about these different iris, but I want to mention, next slide, a book by Sidney B. Mitchell, because he was very important in the Bay Area in the 1930s and 40s. And I have a copy of this book and I've read it. And this is a picture of his garden in the Berkeley Hills, which of course get a lot more rain, but he uses iris, as you can see, and mixes them with other plants. Now, he was an editor of Sunset as well. He's a very interesting man. He helped create the library science program at Berkeley, and he founded the Masters of Library Science program there. And he was doing this as a hobby. And a very close friend of his was very interested in bearded iris hybrids and was creating some, and this friend suddenly died. And so in addition to all his work in library science, Sidney Mitchell suddenly became interested in iris. I mean, it really changed the course of his life. But he became the president of the California Library Association, but also the California Horticultural Society. And Wikipedia describes him as one of the 100 most important leaders in library science. And so that's a significant part of his career, but then he helped organize the American Iris Society, and he wrote several books, including one entirely about iris. And I've read some of the early issues of Sunset. So he's a great authority on bearded iris. And it's interesting to know that so much of the early hybrid work was actually done in this area. Next slide. This is one of my favorite slides because it shows a very early tall bearded iris. People who talk about iris call them TBIs, tall bearded iris. And this iris is called Purissima. And this is a photograph of Mr. Pilkington, who was the president of the British Iris Society. And it shows him in his garden in 1938. And so that's just about the time that the Williams Garden is flourishing. And these iris, I never believed this photograph, but this year I've raised one of these Purissima iris in my own backyard, and I measured it yesterday. It's 56 inches tall. So they are really extraordinarily tall. And so it was hybridized by this friend of Stanley Mitchell, William Moore. And it was introduced in 1927. And this particular bearded iris doesn't survive well in the East or the Midwest. It can't take a cold, wet winter. Now I'm going to show you some other iris in the Williams Garden. Next. So this is Purissima in the Williams Garden. And that's an old yew tree that the Williams planted that now covers a great deal of the garden. And you can see it's probably too shady, but gardens change and that's what happened. And you can see in the Williams Garden, Purissima isn't the giant that it was in Mr. Pilkington's garden or in mine. It's really out of scale in my garden. I'm going to dig it up and give it away. I mean, it is wonderful though. It was called one of the outstanding iris hybrids ever. And it has been the parent of any number of really beautiful white irises. Now you can see these early iris aren't as elaborate as later ones, the falls really fall and the standards do go up, but they're much less embellished than the recent introductions of iris. Next. Now, in the Williams Garden, there are two beds that have been there for a long time. I can't begin to say how long they've been there, but they survived this long period of neglect while the city of Palo Alto decided what to do with the property. And some of them are Iris Douglasiana, and some of them are called Iris innominata, meaning unnamed, no, not for sure. And they intermingle, so it's hard to tell them apart. They need very little water, less fertilizer, and they enjoy shade. The Scots explorer and botanist David Douglas visited North America 3 times in the 1820s. And on his second trip, he introduced a number of pine trees, including what is now called the Douglas fir. In all, he introduced something like 200 plant species, and many others bear his name, Douglas, in their scientific names. And the now popular Pacific Coast hybrids of iris are descendants from the Iris Douglasiana. And they come in a beautiful range of colors. So I would encourage you to get some of those. And also, these are much easier to live with. They're very much more casual. You don't have to divide them every 3 to 5 years, obviously. They don't want that kind of attention. Gamble has a group of them planted, the Pacific Coast recent hybrids in the native garden close to Embarcadero. And I think they're just now coming into bloom. Next. Another iris, and it was planted at the Williams Garden with vinca. I'm just sort of showing you that the colors can vary from almost white to lavender to a deeper color. And as I say, they cross. And so some of that has happened in that garden as well. Okay, next, please. These photographs were taken not this spring, but last year. I was going to give, I guess, a lecture about iris and before the epidemic interrupted. Anyway, this is an interesting iris. It's a medium iris. It's not as tall. And I was introduced to her first as Eleanor Roosevelt and thought she was hybridized in 1933. And I've been told more recently that she probably isn't Eleanor Roosevelt at all, and that she's Crimson King, and he was introduced in 1893. So this is an iris that's undergone a name change and a sex change. Next slide. Now this is an iris that some people like because it has red berries, but it self-seeds wildly. And we're trying to reduce its, there were lots of these in the Williams Garden, but we've reduced their numbers slightly. And it has a strange smell. Now I haven't talked about the fragrance of iris. They have a distinctive fragrance, which I find very difficult to describe, and I don't generally cut them and bring them into the house. I leave them out into the garden. But if you want to study historic irises, what you should do is on your computer, check out the Dykes Award. William Dykes, D-Y-K-E-S, was a fancier of iris, and the first year of the awards was 1927. And actually a tall bearded iris called San Francisco, hybridized by this Mr. Moore, who was a friend of Sidney Mitchell, received the award. So you can see that the Bay Area is really tied to the bearded iris development. And San Francisco and some of the other early bearded iris are really tall. And I will talk a little bit more about that later. Next slide. Oh, no, this is Iris unguicularis, and it's a winter blooming iris that I really love. And it's not on a stem, it's on a tube, little short flowers. And like the Douglas iris, it can be sort of left alone and the clump gets larger and larger and larger. And it's through blooming right now. Okay, next. Now I've introduced Iris confusa to the Williams garden. This is a photograph actually of it in my own garden. It's an iris in the leaves, whose leaves gracefully flop over rather than stand upright. And it's got very small flowers and it blooms very early. It's one of the first plants in spring to bloom. And I really love it. Its common name is sort of bamboo iris, and it's native to Western China. It's frost sensitive, like many iris are. Each stem has something like 10 leaves, and on each stem, there are little branches that have 3 to 5 flowers. And so it just makes a wonderful background. And so next slide, I have another one that shows you a little more about what the flowers look like. This is a little bit better in terms of identifying their markings of yellow and purple, and they're low, and they spread like bamboo, hence the nickname. Now, the trouble with finding an iris like this is you really have to order it from a specialist nursery. You probably wouldn't see it in a nursery, and the whole decline of nurseries is a sad topic that I'm really not going to get into, but very few nursery stock iris anymore. So you really have to buy them online. Okay, next. Now, among the iris in the Williams garden that I haven't identified is this one. And maybe one of you has some suggestions. I know approximately its date because you can see some of the early iris are very much alike, and the falls are unruffled. They're quite distinct from later ones, and some of them have this pattern on the falls. So it's not San Francisco, but it's somewhat similar. Now I'm going to show you next, please. This is a bitone. So the falls are a darker color and the standards are a much lighter. And what I love about this is a rather translucent, but several of these were enormously popular. And so I can't tell you which one, but they all received Dykes Awards around 1930. And this actually is in my own garden, but the sunlight on the iris, when it's transparent like that, is really very beautiful. Next. And here is another one. It's not the same iris, but it's very similar. So you can see why I don't feel that some of them are called Ramses. I mean, I could reel off 4 or 5 names of iris that it could be, but I don't know exactly. Next. Now, this is Miss Gamble's. This is an iris, a recent, relatively recent iris named in honor of Miss Gamble. It was raised and hybridized by Lois O'Brien, who was a good friend of Miss Gamble's. And so here it is blooming, and you can see how much more ruffles and so on. But I was given one and it never bloomed. And a friend, this is a friend, Jane Stockland, raised it, and she said she had it for 4 years before it bloomed. So maybe I haven't had mine long enough, or I don't know. But again, it's very tall. It's like Clarissima. It's a very dominating flower in the garden. Now I want to just talk about 1 or 2 iris that are interesting, but not necessarily in the Williams garden or at Gamble. And they belong to a group called the Spuria. And Spuria actually means bastard. And some Spurias are 4 or 5 feet tall. and they form large, tall clumps. And you see them around Palo Alto, sometimes in a city strip. And they're among the hardiest survivors, but they're, again, very hard to find. And at the Williams Garden, there's a yellow one, which is lower. It doesn't fit this description, it's quite different. But I know that Barbara Whirl, who was an important gardener in this area, Barbara bought it from Western Hills, which was a very important nursery that has gone out of business. And so there's also a garden on Middlefield Road and near Loma Verde. It's behind the Catholic Church, St. Aquinas meeting center or something. And they grow lots of iris. It's worth a trip. So it's near Loma Verde. It's on the on the west side of the street. And there's a driveway. And you can drive from Middlefield over all the way to Cowper on property that belongs to the Catholic Church. And you drive by this iris garden. And this is, of course, a good time of year to do that. So in closing, I just want to say to several of you, please join the Iris Enthusiasts Club and go out in gardens and really observe. I've been observing my iris during this pandemic much more closely than I have in the past, and it's been a very rewarding experience. And I'm going to show you a little bouquet. Just one second.
Oh,
And so this is Porissima. This is the one that is 56 inches high. And this is one tiny little branch. This is Eleanor Roosevelt or Crimson King. And these very dainty little things, both in blue and white, are this Iris confusa. And they're blooming, all of these are blooming right now in my garden. And the iris season hasn't really begun. I'm going to have lots more blooming. Now, being a curator of works, I wanted to show you how the iris sort of functions as a plant. But this was too tall. I did not bring this iris into my house. But I want to show you some of the lesser. So this is the winter blooming iris, Iris unguicularis, that is on a short stem. And it just grows in a clump that gets bigger and bigger. And this is either Eleanor Roosevelt or Crimson King. It's a very nice size for a smaller garden. And it blooms during the winter. It can start blooming in December and bloom all the way into March. And if it's really happy, sometimes it blooms twice a year, but not often. And this is the Iris confusa. So you can see what the leaves look like. See, they're very graceful. And then it wanders. So this is why it's called the bamboo iris. When I dug this up to show you, it had already wandered off and was producing two new clumps. And it's just like a regular iris. Once the center part of an iris dies after it's produced its bloom. And so you cut that off. And the new growth will come sort of as a Y shape on either side of the bloom that you're cutting off. So in closing, I want to say, please go out and get firsthand experience and firsthand hours in your gardens. But also, I like to think when I'm out in my garden of what plant came from whom. Both Betsy Klepsch, who wrote a book about salvia, and Barbara Whirl, both were wonderful gardeners and friends of mine. And I have plants that they gave me, and that means a lot to me that they gave me those plants. And then I also think of Edith Wharton and her classic 1906 books about Italian Renaissance gardens. And I go back and look at that, not for iris, but just as a reference point. And a recent book by Vivian Russell, who also wrote about Monet's garden, and she's a British TV personality and garden enthusiast who took marvelous photographs of her gardens in all seasons. And the reason I mentioned her book is she's wonderful about recording the different seasons. So you see some of these famous gardens with snow and so on. And I just want to say that one should visit a garden numerous times to really understand that once or twice is not enough. So please go out in your garden. And now we're going to have Allison or somebody talk. Oh, well, all right, yes, two more. This is Monet at the very end. And we're not going to have a garden ever that looks like that here, probably in Palo Alto. But again, you can see sort of the stature of the iris, but also the interplantings. And at Gamble now, they have moved the iris and interplanted them, and they're near the gazebo. And most of them haven't started to bloom, so you're going to have to wait a little bit, but they will bloom within the next, they will start blooming in the next couple of weeks. And what I discovered is one kind will all bloom pretty much within a week. And then the next kind will, so you have an unfolding rainbow of iris in your garden. Okay, thank you. Oh, now the iris raffle. Am I supposed to talk about this, or is Allison going to talk? We are going to
talk about it, Betsy.
You're going to
talk about it.
Okay.
So I wanted to thank you, Betsy, for the interesting lecture. I also wanted to let you know that MOA will be doing an iris raffle. We'll be giving away a variety of irises, some that Betsy has shown you. It is free to enter your name in the raffle if you'd like. You can email me at mail@moa.org, and that's on the screen here. All of the winners will be notified by email. Directions for picking up the irises at MOA will be given in the summertime. And I hope you'll enter to win one of these historic irises.
Well, and that's perfect timing for us to segue into a little bit of a question and answer period.
You talk.
So Betsy, thank you so much. We have a number of questions. Okay, we'll wait for this sharing screen. Can we do that, Doug? So I'll just begin. Yeah, here we go. So people are curious about a number of things. The iris with the berries. So we have a question. What happens with those berries once the iris bloom? Do they drop? Do they produce? What, can you just mention that? What happens?
Yes, certainly. Well, the iris, like a seed from another plant, it will be propagated by just growing in the ground. Now, some iris do produce seed pods. Carissima, that early iris, produced seed pods. But
yeah, there are, but it's going to be interesting to see what he does or doesn't do.
Somebody unmute? Okay, go ahead.
So generally, the way you pass on iris is you cut up a rhizome. And actually, I was going to cut one up, but I somehow forgot to. But you cut it up and you just replant the new part. As the iris ages, every year you can see how long it's been since somebody has divided it. I mean, it has a little body, and then it sort of does a Y, and then from the Ys, it continues to make a Y pattern. And so most iris are propagated by the rhizome or the bulb itself. But some of them do self-seed, but then it takes a long time to get anything from the seed.
Yeah. So the Williams iris that were planted maybe in the 30s. So do we view the iris there today as dating back to those?
Yes.
We do.
Yeah. Yes.
those are what we could call them historic iris. really.
Historic iris.
Yeah.
And if you really get into it, you can join the Historic Iris Society. And I did briefly and got their newsletters, and it's a very active group. And there's
that's
another iris group in the East Bay called the Stanley Mitchell Iris Group.
okay, because that was a question. So there is a local iris group, Stanley.
Yes, yes.
So would you just briefly explain some of the parts of the iris flower, the falls, the
Well,
standard?
I'm not a botanist, so let's see.
If you could just point out those parts, I think people would enjoy that.
So this is Eleanor Roosevelt, or maybe. And these are the falls. And these are the sepals, and then the petals are the ones that go upright and are called the standard. And then here's the little beard, which is often white, not always. And I'm not going to get deeply into this. And iris generally produce 2 flowers from what looks like a single bud. After this goes, you see, there's another flower. I don't know if you can see coming along there, and that's quite standard.
Okay, so remind us that the Parissima iris is white.
Yes, it's the one that grows so tall. As I said, this is 56 inches in my garden.
Ah,
So this is just part of it. It probably has 2 other branches, and each one will have 4 or 5 iris growing out of it. Maybe you can.
so you mentioned that at Gamble, the iris have been planted within the beds, perennial beds and so on, which of course I've seen. Were the iris planted in those circular beds at the Williams house? Was that typical of the time?
Well,
Rather than,
some people isolate the iris, and because of their growth habit, you want to leave enough room around them, but you don't really want to cover the rhizomes with annuals or perennials, because the rhizomes absorb the light, and if you bury them too deeply, you can rot them.
so my last question is probably what we all want to know. So how did the iris interest you? Did you always love them? Did you get interested at the Williams? How did that happen?
Well, actually, after we moved to California in 1967, we had a neighbor on Garland near Middlefield who was a geologist, and he and his wife had a very nice garden, and they brought me some rhizomes from their garden, and I didn't know their names or anything, but I knew that they probably dated back to when this subdivision was created in the late 40s. And then they gave me fuchsias, and we have fuchsias from the same donor. And then many years later, somebody arrived at the door with this big box of iris saying, "We know you are interested in historic plants." And they were in the Lucy Stern beds, and they were dug up, and we don't want to throw them out. We want to give them to somebody. Well, I should have given them to Gamble, but I didn't think of it. But anyway, I have all these historic iris, which Gamble already has. And so Gamble and the Williams garden and my own garden, really, we all have iris from the 30s and 40s, pre-World War II.
Right.
By the 50s, they become much frillier. They're sort of very different creatures.
Right. Well, Betsy, I just want to thank you. All of us have thoroughly enjoyed this program, and it's so timely because the iris are either blooming or getting ready to bloom, and we should all go out and see them. So I want to encourage everybody to visit the Museum of American Heritage at 351 Homer Avenue, and they are open Friday through Sunday from 11 to 4. It's really lots of things blooming, so you'll enjoy that. Also get over to Gamble at 1431 Waverly, where you have access most of the time. Everybody knows on Tuesday and Wednesday, the gardens are closed for gardening in the morning, but then you can go in the afternoon and enjoy that garden. Both gardens have gorgeous displays of iris for you to enjoy. And thank you all for joining us in this really interesting and timely talk. I learned more about the Williams than I could ever imagine, Betsy, and that place will mean more to me and everybody else because I know about Tom and Dora Williams and their family. Thank you all for joining us. It's really been delightful. And thank you again, Betsy. Good night.